Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the T.H.O. Movie Reviews Podcast, the show where we bring you passionate, honest, and insightful film criticism. I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson, and before we get started, I want to say it's trust and character I need around me. One podcast for knowing what a man's made of. That's a price I can live with. And joining me on that podcast today is Geoff Wallace. Geoff, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well.
It's good to have you, and as I'm sure a lot of you can guess from my mangled version of a Han quote there, we are talking about F9 today. But before we get into it, Geoff, you mentioned that you might rewatch some of the Fast and Furious movies before we talked about this. Did you end up taking a cinematic trip down memory lane?
I only ended up watching The Fate of the Furious because I hadn't seen that one.
So you're probably still getting like the particles of ice like off you after.
You might need to take a flamethrower to myself. I found it kind of terrible, actually. I don't know, maybe it was just because it was on the heels of F7 and it couldn't really compete with all of the things that movie had going for it and made it successful. Maybe they didn't even try. There were just so many things about it that bugged me. The fact that most of the cars and scenes seemed to be digital and not even real. There's just so many questionable choices. Of course, the ending with the submarine and physics just kind of going out the window in an unbelievable sort of way. A car outrunning a missile. I was actually comparing the F8 with F9 just because they seem to have a lot of similarities, or at least a few notable ones. It just kind of seemed like a hokey movie.
I remember, after I watched it, I texted you, and I was like, this is the Die Another Day of Fast and Furious movies. And I think perhaps I was overstating the matter a bit because there was no ice palace in The Fate of the Furious. But there
was ice, but no car chase through a melting landscape, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. I'm glad you brought up The Fate of the Furious because I think that leads into F9 nicely. I mean, definitely I think that, the Fast and Furious movies, as crazy and bonkers as they can get, the best ones I think kind of like maintain the spirit of the first film, like that just kind of straightforward appeal of dudes driving fast cars and bound together by loyalty, family, that fantasy of like having this kind of extended family around you that is all about closeness, but also, fun and daredevil action. As big as the series has gotten, like you can still feel that spirit in Fast 5, for instance. But with The Fate of the Furious, we have remote control cars like driving like as an army basically through New York, and it's the kind of the old vibe is lost amid the cartoon antics. With F9, definitely there's a need for a reset, and I have to think that the studio knew it, Vin Diesel knew it. Otherwise, why would they, ask Justin Lin to come back and direct the movie? Because, I mean, God, he'd already directed 4 of those movies. I feel like you don't ask him back unless something is really wrong and needs to be fixed, unless you need a kind of a proven entity to kind of steer the car back on course. So I ask you, Geoff, I mean, how successful a reset do you think this movie was? Like, how close do you think it comes to that goal of getting things back on track?
I do feel like the production of the film involved a lot more practical stunts and just actual cars getting smashed, unless the CGI is just that good. But I do feel like that at least brought an element of realness even as the movie veered into the unreal. And that was at least a sign to me that something was being brought back. Something about the film and the franchise was being brought back to its center, grounding it more. I think maybe one of the most essential grounding elements is the choice to have Dom's backstory woven throughout the film in a pretty straightforward way, even with some surreal flourishes. But it did seem like at least those two elements were an attempt to kind of bring it back to, I don't know, less about submarine chases and more just about a family working together. It makes sense that if you want to make the movie seem more realistic, that you would bring in like a new level of storytelling about family, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. I'm glad you bring up the backstory because, I thought in the eighth film, going for the whole like Vin Diesel has a son he never knew he had. I thought that
Right.
kind of smacked of desperation. And then when I heard the ninth film was going to be about his evil brother, I was like, oh no, that's kind of getting desperate too. And to my absolute shock, that was one of the parts I enjoyed most about this movie. I mean, it's so crazy to see, this anecdote about the death of Dominic Toretto's father and beating a guy with a crowbar, to see that finally actually filmed and to have woven the story about, brotherhood and kind of like broken bonds into that. It almost sounds crazy to say, but it's this mythic, saga of like the Toretto dynasty now. And I'm struck by how epic that, mythology feels. Like there's a grandeur to the story of these two brothers who are driven apart in childhood, and then they kind of reemerge as enemies, and they have to decide are they gonna cling to old hatreds, or are they going to evolve? And I thought it was kind of cool beginning the movie with that, grounding that right in there, and I'm almost like stunned at how well it worked.
I found that to be really enjoyable and effective as well. I just remembered thinking, like, as that was the opening scene, I was like, oh, this feels fresh in some way. Maybe even just after F8, like maybe it's not as fresh if you look at the series as a whole, but it was still effective within that transition between movies.
As I've watched these films, I've become obsessed with Justin Lin and watched some of his other films. And he said something really interesting on the Treatment podcast. He said that, the studio will kind of like break down the franchise and say, oh, it appeals to these demographics. And Justin Lin said, hey, ultimately what I feel is that this is a working class franchise about working class characters. And I feel like some of that got lost along the way. I mean, certainly in the eighth one, where they're basically de facto special forces agents with all this technology at their disposal, and
Right.
magic Tony Stark style holograms. We're kind of losing that working class vibe. But now in the ninth one, it's interesting, like the specific portrayal of the Torettos as like a working class family, and we learn later in the film, spoiler alert, we're going to do full spoilers in this because that's how we roll. We find out that Dom and Jacob's father had money problems, and that ultimately led to his death. And then Jacob, of course, ends up allying himself with this sort of obnoxious wealthy character, and at the end it's the two working class brothers teaming up against the wealthy character. And that's really, I think picking up kind of where Fast Five left off, with the climax literally being the destruction of like this affluent part of Rio, where it's like it's almost like kind of like the revenge of these working class characters, destroying all these like expensive buildings with a bank vault. Like it feels like
right
F9's getting in touch with that again, kind of.
I don't know if that the financier's character's country of origin is ever revealed, but he does say at some point, rich pricks like me are the ones who win or run the world, or
yeah,
the exact words don't matter. It's just the intention of what he was saying. But I hadn't really hit on how that tied into the themes from the other films in the franchise. But I think you're right. It really does bring it back in this film. There is definitely a repeated note of I'm rich and I can do anything if I just throw enough money at it, which turns out to be wrong. Like you said, the brothers prove him wrong. They literally flip the script on him by
oh, I see what you did.
by flipping his Universal Soldier inspired armored truck RV caterpillar vehicle. It would be interesting if they brought the working class theme back even more. I think it's definitely prevalent in the backstory in the movie, though I don't necessarily know how clearly that theme from the backstory segments transfers over to the segments in the present.
Yeah, I think that's something we definitely need to address because for me, I love Kurt Russell, but I've always been a little bit uneasy about his presence in these movies because he's an establishment figure in a nice suit, and the idea of Dom and the family working for him doesn't necessarily sit right with me. That feels like a little bit going against the spirit of the series. F9, basically the kind of quote Joseph Campbell, the call to adventure is Kurt Russell being in danger. That's what gets the whole mission going.
Right.
And not only that, we find out back during Tokyo Drift, Han was working for Kurt Russell. I almost feel like Justin Lin is going like Kurt Russell is now this, not even really a character, but a tool I can use to fill any plot hole or make anything happen. Kurt Russell is like the briefcase in Inception, or something like that. Whatever. He's the MacGuffin in a sense, even though there's an actual physical MacGuffin. I feel like that tension is either going to be resolved or it won't be. I think it would be smart to try and reconcile that, because otherwise, this is just going to be a series of generic action movies. And as much as people joke about the Fast and Furious films, a Fast and Furious film, at its best, is a very specific thing with specific elements. It has, crazy car chases that defy logic. It, emphasizes family not by blood, but as an idea of found family. And it always ends with a barbecue,
Yeah.
It's almost like a religious ceremony.
I had a weird thought that, so right before the barbecue scene in this film, Dom's son, Ryan, little B, playing with a toy car that's a replica of Dom's car and a space shuttle, and smashing them together, which I thought was maybe a subtle joke about them going into space. I briefly imagined that none of the movie had actually happened, and it was just the kid imagining it. And maybe it's because the barbecue sequences seem to have this surreal tone to them. The lighting is almost heavenly, but it would just be funny if it was actually, none of it was actually real, and they were just a family that got together once a week for a barbecue, and then they were just imagining all the other stuff that happened. I mean, obviously that's not a realistic reading of the films, but it did. I think it was just the treatment of those barbecue scenes felt kind of hyper real and lent a sort of reality to it that seemed more potent in some ways than what had come before it. It makes me wonder what's the fantasy and what's the reality of the films.
I mean, there's a lot going on in these barbecue scenes. I mean, we could probably do a podcast just about Fast and Furious barbecues. I mean, it is interesting because, in a sense, they're the most real scenes in these movies, because they're some of the few scenes in these movies that could actually happen and actually have an element of realism. And yet they also have the element of being fantasies in and of themselves, like this kind of fantasy that, oh, everyone, no matter where they come from, no matter who they are, they can all kind of like unite around the barbecue with
Right.
Vin Diesel. I mean, I think it's interesting you bring up the lighting, because the lighting in the barbecue scenes is often, in contrast to a lot of other parts of the films, it's often very, very bright. It is kind of heavenly to a certain degree. And then, I mean, to top it all off, like the film F9 ending with, the ghost of Paul Walker, driving up to join them. I mean, it's almost like a Thanksgiving dinner or something, where that relative that has died, that everybody misses, shows up in a spiritual sense, and that everyone's thinking about them. But in this case, no, he literally shows up. That's the end of the movie. This car in this iconic shade of blue coming up. A scene like that has to be there. It's like the end scene in a Bond film where Bond kisses the Bond girl. I mean, not that like all the films end with a barbecue, because they don't, but they all have to end with something like that. They either, barbecue, or they go to the beach or something.
Sure.
It's the moment of kind of like communal spirit, and it's really the kind of the only way you can wrap it all up properly. We talked a little bit about action. I think, since really in a lot of ways the action is the star attraction of these films, we should get into that. I enjoyed some of the action beats in this film a lot, but I do feel like you can see some wear and tear. I mean, what did you make of the action?
I don't know. There were enough things going on that made me question my disbelief to the point of suspending it, that by the time the final major set piece was underway, I was totally on board.
Nice.
The conceit of the super magnets that defy magnet physics. I know we've already said the word grounded 5 or 6 or 10 times, but it just seemed like a much better choice for some kind of goofy action motivating element, because unlike, I don't know, a lot of the things in F8, at least with magnets, you can, as a super device, as a crazy weapon, when you use them, they have immediate and entertaining results. So yeah, when they're just throwing cars around and ripping stuff out of boutique shops, I was just like laughing in a like a excited way.
I feel like when I started to feel a bit more reassured that, like, okay, Justin Lin has still got it, was when you have the scene in Edinburgh where, first of all, we have Vin Diesel and John Cena running across rooftops, which is great, because even though it's all about car action, I'm one of those people who's like, well, I want them to get out of their cars and run sometimes, bring some real physicality to the action, because I loved that chase through the favela in Fast 5. And then also I like how you have, this rooftop chase going on simultaneously with Natalie Emanuel, whose character can't drive, driving this truck out of control down these windy streets. Like, that was one of those kind of great, like, sort of incredulous mashups of, just total craziness. And I feel like if there was a moment when it felt like, okay, they still know how to do this, it was then. And then also at the end, I liked taking out the drone with the big giant truck thing, and then with the magnets, I like the magnets too. And for some reason, this was just a really simple detail, but I like how the only orange Toyota that Han drives, I liked how they were using the magnet to kind of attach it to the truck while they climb into the truck. It was just such a small thing that like, oh, this is how we're going to use the magnets to like hold this car steady while we climb onto this other vehicle. Tiny little things like that make the action more like kind of delightfully unbelievable. Of course, we did a podcast about Tenet, and I think you were the one who was saying that the cars in Tenet don't go fast enough, right, Geoff?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, which I thought was, I mean, like, I was glad you said that, because I had thought that and hadn't articulated that. I mean, one thing about the Fast and Furious movies, good action, bad action, the cars always go fast enough, and they certainly do here.
They do, yeah. Yeah, something you said in there reminded me of what was maybe my favorite scene in Fast 8, which is when Jason Statham has secured little Brian in the baby carrier and then engages in some like John Wick style fighting as he tries to fight his way out of the plane while still occasionally checking in with the baby and making sure that the baby's okay. And the baby produces a number of pretty hilarious little hand gestures. And but yeah, like you said, sometimes you need to get out of the car and have some kind of physical, really human activity. I mean, Jason Statham's charm really carries that particular scene. And I think what you said about Dom and Jacob fighting it out in the rooftops, it almost made me wonder if John Cena insisted that they write in like a, WWE style fighting sequence. I know that's something that's kind of been derided. The fighting scenes seem like superhuman. Like he punches through a wall, or not a wall, but like a column. And then he picks up Dom and smashes his head through a doorway. Later on, you get the fight atop the semi between John Cena and, I looked up this actor's name, Martin something. Anyway, he's a crazy huge guy. The actor who plays the henchman, rich guy's henchman. He's like 6'8", 310 pounds. The tattoos on the side of his head are his own tattoos. Anyway, like they're fighting on top of the semi truck, and Martin, the giant dude, just his body goes right through like a roadway sign, and he seems fairly unfazed. I don't know. I guess I was curious if you thought that twisting of physics, along with like cars being used to catch people, if that took away from some of the realism, insofar as there is realism in Fast and Furious movies, or if it just seemed like this is a Fast and Furious, just what happens. People punch through walls and fall off buildings, but get caught by cars, and it's okay. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that's such a great question. I mean, it kind of cuts right to the soul of the series, honestly. And I feel that the answer to that is that I have, very different expectations for these movies than I do have for a lot of action movies. Like, one of my favorite action moments, really in the history of film, is in The Bourne Ultimatum when Matt Damon's running across this rooftop in Tangier. There's a bunch of glass, like right on the edge of the building. He grabs some clothes off a clothesline and uses them to kind of like pad his hands as he leaps over this side of the building covered in glass. And I love how they address that detail of like, no, Matt Damon is not superhuman. He can't just like touch a bunch of like shards of glass and not get cut or something. He has to protect himself. But at the same time, the Fast and Furious films, despite also being distributed by Universal, they're not the Bourne films, and I have come to feel that the bending of certain elements of reality and physics is kind of part of the fun with Fast and Furious. And I have to say, I really liked the kind of meta commentary that comes from Tyrese, where he's like, we've survived all this, we must be invincible. And for a terrible moment, I thought for sure that like the film was going to do some kind of retconning to say like, oh, they've been superheroes the whole time, they have like some kind of power, and that explains all this crazy shit they get up to. And I love how instead the scene ends with Ludacris just saying to Tyrese, "You're a dumbass." And that I felt like that was like, in a way, the movie saying, no, there's no explanation for how they survive all this madness. Just sit back and enjoy the show. And I'm of two minds, because I don't want things to get too crazy. I mean, definitely, I feel like no more submarines. Hopefully, no more remote control cars. God willing, hopefully, no more like crazy MacGuffins that can just magically spy on everyone in the world, because that, like, yes, that's somewhat rooted in reality, but I also think it makes things too easy. Like Vin Diesel hitting his apparently very strong skull on window frame and being totally fine. That I feel like I can live with, you know.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with your reasoning on that. It reminds me of I was watching Chris Stuckman's review of the movie. I think he might have given it a C or a C minus. But one of his central points was that while he expects the movies to be somewhat unrealistic, he felt as though this was the first film where it veered just straight into sci-fi. I think he was maybe a little misguided by believing that the series wasn't sci-fi already. At least in a more basic sense of science fiction, which is how cars do and do not work. I mean, yeah, it went to space. So that's like a pretty classic sci-fi component, but I think we were already in some level of science fiction, and that can be extended to how characters' bodies react to being smashed through parts of old apartment buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of tend to feel like that we entered science fiction territory the minute Paul Walker and Tyrese like jumped a car onto a boat back in Too Fast, Too Furious, you know, and honestly, maybe even before then, arguably. But I gotta say, I think you're right. But it's kind of funny, you know, the going to space part of it. All of us have joked like, haha, wouldn't it be funny if they went to space in a Fast and Furious movie? And the crazy thing is that they do it in this movie, and instead of being a joke, it's actually, you know, really a touching scene where Tyrese is like, you know, we're not invincible. If we go out together. And after it, I was like, I can't believe this. You know, the proverbial joke about Fast and Furious in space, like, actually turns out to be like kind of this moving character moment. Like, what? You know, I don't know, that I feel like that's, you know, the movie's like kind of playing the greatest trick on us ultimately, because I assumed if they ever went to space, it was going to be, you know, like Moonraker or something, you know, or we were going to have like the Fast and Furious version of like the moon chase in Ad Astra or whatever, and instead it's actually like this kind of sweet male bonding moment, improbably.
I think the way it was depicted, even, you know, as unlikely as it is that you could take a Pontiac Fiero and turn it into a rocket ship and make it safe for low orbit exploration, it was done so in a way that I feel like directly contrasts the climax of the eighth film, which is that they showed what was happening and continued to show what was happening until it played out in a somewhat believable way. Like, you had the rocket car on top of a jet. You see the jet like get up to the right altitude. The rocket car jumps off and probably defies physics by launching in the way that it does. But then you get like a nice shot that kind of reminded me of any number of other going from the Earth to space movies. You get like a tight shot on the rocket car as it kind of zooms up and out of the atmosphere, and then it's in orbit. And that just seems like such a stark contrast to the bizarre, hyper edited sequence of the climax of the eighth film with like sports cars outrunning a submarine and then the submarine somehow catching them. And this has been kind of puzzling me for a while, and the only way I can really boil it down is by saying that, like, if you just show the thing happening, it makes more sense, which is really reductive. But if you just show the rocket car like taking off and getting into orbit, it makes more sense than if you have a sequence of a turbocharged sports car racing on a frozen bay and outrunning a missile and turning around and somehow making it back to a submarine in time to have the missile meet up with it. And I just feel like I'm spinning my wheels. But does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, I want to like kind of zero in on what you're saying, Geoff, because you rightly point out if you just show something happening, you know, that's the best way to do it. I mean, there's a certain purity to that scene in space in the ninth film, compared to the eighth, where, it's like we're shuffling between all these frantic pieces, the submarine, the cars on the ice, the fights between individual characters. I think that, a lot of it comes down to Justin Lin's skill as an action director. And frankly, I'm not even like sure. I'm not sure like where it comes from, because, Tokyo Drift was his fourth film, and back then he already, showed an incredible knack for this kind of thing. And especially that chase in the middle of the film where you have, it's a three-way chase. You got the Drift King and Lucas Black and Han, and Han is in the lead in the chase. Lucas Black's behind him. The Drift King's behind him. And the editing in the film, it always cuts in that pattern. Han, Lucas Black, Drift King. It's this, kind of regimented thing to help us make sense of the chaos. And I just feel like, in Lin's Fast and Furious films, like there's always this sense of, I'm not going to fuck around. I'm going to do this in the most straightforward way possible, so you can actually see what's going on and appreciate the physical stakes, even when they're totally improbable. I feel like it's kind of like the opposite of the sort of Quantum of Solace mentality of, cut to everything as fast as you possibly can, which I think that kind of pushes the audience out of the action. Whereas I think that the kind of almost simplicity of, the Fast and Furious action, it's drawing you in. It's getting you more involved, because the more aware you are of each detail, the more you lean in and go like, oh wow, I see that, John Cena is ziplining from this point to this point, and I see where Vin Diesel, is in relation to him. Therefore, like I'm in suspense because I know how far and how fast Vin Diesel has to run to catch up with him. And it's it seems simple, but it actually, I think it takes so much thought and skill and intelligence, really.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what you just spoke to now illuminates what I was thinking, that yeah, it's about purity of the scene and the logistics of it. You have to present things in a way that makes sense. You have to be able to mete out how much time each little thing gets. And for a director like Justin Lin, who is clearly quite talented with action and set pieces, he has a pretty good understanding of, how much time to spend on each separate component of an action sequence, and present it in a way that makes sense. Like what you just said, John Cena's on a zip line, Vin Diesel's running. Those are two things that everybody can understand. How fast somebody's moving on a zip line, how fast somebody can run across the rooftops in Edinburgh, whereas nobody can really understand how fast a Lamborghini should be driving on a frozen bay, or how quickly a nuclear missile sub should be moving. And yeah, maybe that kind of speaks to the heart of the franchise. Is ideally it should be the improbable presented in a relatable and understandable way. Like as goofy as some of the NOS sequences were in the very first film, you at least knew, like, oh, you turn on this thing and the car goes really fast.
Yes. It's so simple. Speaking of the improbable and delightful, I think we should talk about the return of Han, which is obviously a big selling point for this movie. But before we got started, I was thinking about Han's journey over the course of all the films, and really his journey starts back in Better Luck Tomorrow, since the character was introduced in that film, and then kind of I guess teleported over to Tokyo Drift, which is kind of an amazing thing in and of itself. We finally get Han back after he was quote unquote killed off, and we finally get this really long interlude in the movie that kind of lays out the full story of what really happened to Han, how he returned and what he's been doing during the last few movies, it's kind of an insane saga that almost warrants a movie in and of itself. It's kind of beautiful and also sort of defies belief, not necessarily in a bad way, especially when you combine it with, the previous films and then Better Luck Tomorrow before that. He has this whole, crazy mythic journey that I think in a weird but unmistakable way, it sort of makes sense emotionally, but it's definitely strange. And I wanted to get your take on that that part of the film, Geoff. What do you make of the film's explanation of what Han's life has been like and how he left and how he finally comes back?
I definitely agree with a lot of the notes that you were hitting on there. Like Han, it was great to have him come back. I remember him as being one of the more enjoyable characters. I might have been misremembering things, but when they had him walk into that secret base, whatever it was, and he was eating,
yeah,
I feel like that was a character trait of his that was often played for humor, and I thought it was nice to see that element brought back. I felt both surprised and I don't know, overwhelmed by the way his backstory was presented. Like on the one hand, it's a pretty solid, if not wild, backstory. On the other hand, it was really a lot of exposition just all at once. And I don't have a better idea for how you could have done that. I do agree that it probably warrants a movie in its own right. Maybe like a kind of lone wolf and cub style story of the older, wiser, well, not samurai, but agent, I guess.
Sure.
Because he was working for the CIA or whoever Mr. Nobody is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then protecting this girl and training her to become a fighter. That also now makes me think of that movie, Hannah, Eric Bana and Saoirse Ronan, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also the series too. Now that I've heard some of the ideas that you've shared, it kind of struck me as further elevating the working class, the everyman, every person character in a logical way. Like if the working class street racers have been elevated into super spies, then why not elevate this drift racer into another kind of super spy? I don't know about the logistics of how he would have survived that car accident.
I don't think even the people who worked on the movie understand those logistics.
I was almost expecting Mr. Nobody to say something about clones or like body doubles. In the end, it doesn't really matter. It's more just about audience enjoyment, gratification. This character is enjoyable, so why not bring them back? It might add another layer of soap opera to the series than had existed before, but I'm also forgetting who's come back from the dead.
Well, I mean, I think you make a lot of good points, Geoff, and that idea of elevating this drift racer into a super spy. I mean, I think that's kind of interesting, and I know I criticized the Kurt Russell character's role in the story earlier, but I mean, like one positive thing is sort of the idea that Kurt Russell represents the establishment, the world order, if you will, and the idea that order kind of has to make a deal with these outlaws to get the job done and keep everybody safe, and the idea that the system alone is not enough to keep the peace, to rescue people. You need the Dominic Torettos, you need the Hans. That is an interesting thing. I mean, it's ultimately like kind of going back to Westerns, like you have to hire some sort of outlaw to protect the town because he's the only one with the skill to defend it. And then as far as Han's actual journey, the Fast and Furious movies, their obsession with the idea of family is something that is the butt of a lot of jokes, but at the same time, I tend to think that the films is kind of exploration of what family means is quite a bit more nuanced than they're giving credit for. And with Han, kind of in his undercover exile, this guy who's suffered this tremendous loss with Gal Gadot's character being killed, and then he kind of finds this new purpose in working for Kurt Russell, and then adopting a daughter like that, expands the idea of what family means in a new way, I think. And then it makes it really cool that, like Han now comes back, into the fold as a father. So he's not quite the guy that the main characters knew. And I'm kind of like amazed at his whole journey. I think about, okay, you go back to A Better Luck Tomorrow, and he's this high school kid who makes a terrible mistake and is an accessory to murder. Okay, so then he drifts into a life of crime with Dominic Toretto. He falls in love. He loses the woman he loves, so he's grief stricken and goes off to Tokyo. He then is able to channel that grief into being a secret agent while also having a side business where he's ripping off the Yakuza and training Lucas Black how to drift. And then he fakes his death to do even more crazy, super spy stuff, and then becomes a father. It's like, oh my God, this is like an epic poem or something. Like, it just, I mean, the fact that, this was never planned and it was never meant to be this way kind of, I think, adds to the delight of it, that this, frankly, kind of minor character ended up being so appealing and ended up having this life story that is as dramatic as anybody's in these movies, really. Well, I wanted to, as we get into the home stretch, I wanted to ask you about the scene where Vin Diesel is underwater, and he has like this. It's not even really a flashback per se, although maybe there's an element to that. It's more like a vision where he's sorting out like what he needs to do in terms of a relationship with his brother. And then we have Michelle Rodriguez coming down to rescue him, and she's like bathed in this white angelic life, and it's almost like Vin Diesel is resurrected and has had this like almost this spiritual experience or something. Like, I mean, because we touched on like the religious elements of the movie before. I'm curious, like, what you make, Geoff, of these elements of, religion, spirituality, resurrection, which they kind of test the limits, I think, of like how seriously will people really take these movies, and yet there's a kind of like unabashed sincerity, like okay, we're going here. Michelle Rodriguez is this angel who rescues Vin Diesel from hell.
I thought the near death experience vision was an interestingly surreal excursion. I don't remember there being anything quite like that in any of the other films, but it does seem like Dom was sorting out what he needed to do with his brother, and I think also in some ways was maybe kind of projecting himself into Jacob's shoes. We see a moment where he's walking down a hallway, and it's clear that he's actually his young self, or at least we see his young self reflected in a mirror, and he's looking at his dad, who's having some phone call about being super in debt. I took the narrative to mean the dad being in debt and Jacob trying to help him. I took that as though Dom had no idea that they were heavily in debt, and that particular scene was both old Dom, or current Dom, and his younger self putting themselves into Jacob's shoes, because I don't know that there's any way that Dom would have seen the father making that phone call, and then really kind of empathizing with what Jacob would have been going through. I hadn't really thought about Letty as an angel saving him. It's kind of hard for me to say whether that scene is supposed to have religious, spiritual implications, or if they're just borrowing the imagery of, like a saving angel without actually using any of the philosophical underpinnings. I'm inclined to say, given how the franchise works, it might just be the borrowing of the imagery. But you are right to point out that there are religious undertones that can't really be avoided. For one, there's the Toretto cross element. And then I feel like, weren't there a couple conversations about religion or heaven or God or something in this film? I feel like Letty talking to little Brian, maybe. I guess I just assumed that at least Dom and whatever his family might be, given the movie that you're watching, that Christianity is an underlying factor and a guiding force, but not really an obtrusive or obvious element.
I like that you make the distinction between, like just sort of like borrowing this kind of imagery and actually engaging with it philosophically, because I mean, honestly, that's a pretty subtle distinction, and it's so important. I mean, I think that gets missed a lot of the time, but what I like about what you said most of all is the idea of Dom sort of projecting himself into Jacob's shoes, and I honestly had not thought about that scene that way, but I think that's also like a very subtle thing to pull off, and it's kind of amazing. It's the kind of thing that probably a lot of people are not going to appreciate. That the film does well, and it's definitely there, and it's definitely something that a lot of blockbusters they either would not do it at all, or they would do it and get it wrong. And really, you never know what you have until you experience something else that's it's not nearly on the same level. I mean, the first movie I saw after this was I went to a screening of Black Widow. It's kind of shocking, like how poor in quality that film looks compared to this. Like in terms of pacing, in terms of character development, and in terms of the way action is staged. I think it's very easy to take the Fast and Furious series for granted, because it's been around for 20 years, but these really that kind of subtle and beautiful things, a lot of the movies pull them off. And before I watched the films, I never would have thought I'd be saying this, but I'm all in for F10 and 11. Now I'm ready for whatever kind of crazy car shenanigans they cook up. I'm ready for more epic family drama. I guess that brings me to my final question for you, Geoff. I mean, is there anything you have on a wish list of what you want to see in the final films? I mean, I'm sure they won't be the final Fast and Furious films, but they'll be the final ones for this group of characters, I guess.
I doubt this would ever happen, but to just have an unbroken car chase. A car chase without many cuts, or I know that's not necessarily how these movies are made, much less feasible given the bankroll of their stars. But maybe just something more Mission Impossible-ish, which I know the series has been compared to occasionally. In the same way that I think Fast and the Furious commits to family, Mission Impossible might commit to some sort of action realism. I would like to see something that kind of brings it back around to some of the basics and maybe elevates them.
Kind of what you were saying is a friend of mine said, wouldn't it be cool to see a Fast and Furious movie that takes place in 6 hours or something?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm really interested in seeing if they could do a movie along the lines of Speed. I think that'd be really cool. And also, I mean, as far as characters, the Fast and Furious films, they're not like the Dark Knight trilogy. They don't need to, kill characters in brutal ways to, prove that they're serious or real or whatever. So that's my big wish for the last few films. Don't kill any characters. It's like just let everybody be happy. And if anything, like bring some characters back. Like if they want to bring Gal Gadot back to life, I have absolutely no problem with that. Like I'm not, worried about that, like undoing Han's character arc or something. I mean, it's like that's the great thing about being, a Fast and Furious movie. It's like you can deal with a lot of serious stuff, but you kind of have license to be a little bit, silly and just say, like, hey, if audiences want this thing, let's give it to them. We can make it happen. Well, I think that wraps up for today. If you like this podcast, please like and subscribe and follow us on Twitter at T.H.O Movie Reviews. And you can check out all the great reviews and content we have at thomoviereviews.wordpress.com. Once again, I'm your host, Bennett Campbell Ferguson. I'm here with Geoff Wallace, and from all of us here at T.H.O Movie Reviews, no matter how much you like Fast and Furious, please drive safely out there.